It's my pleasure to welcome today Professor Paul Jenkins. Paul is currently the Professor of Architecture Research at the Edinburgh School of Architecture and Landscape Architecture at the University of Edinburgh and Professor of Human Settlements at the School of the Built Environment in Heriot-Watt University. Paul also is visiting professor at the Eduardo Mondlane University of Maputo, the University of the Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, and the University of Sao Paulo. And I just learned at lunch today that, in fact, Paul will shortly be forsaking these shores to take up a full-time position at the University of the Witwatersrand as the director of the School of Architecture and Planning. And some of you may know that that WITS has also in the process of launching a number of sort of flagship centres, including a new centre on cities and the urban. More than half of Paul's career has been based in Central and Southern Africa. Since 1999, he's also been linked to Brazil, this being a function of being one of the few Brits to speak Portuguese, no doubt. And he's published widely on Sub-Saharan African and urban issues, as well as a series of globally focused works. He's currently working on a new book for Routledge titled, quote, Order and Disorder in Urban Space and Form. And today Paul's going to speak to us on understanding urbanisation, urbanism and urbanity in African cities, home spaces and house cultures in Maputo, Mozambique. So please give a very warm welcome to the last of our distinguished lecturers for this academic year's series, Professor Paul Jenkins. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and the introduction. I'd like this to be fairly informal, and what I suggest, I'll structure the talk around more or less along this line. Perhaps expand a little bit on the introduction that Steve's given so that you understand a little bit about where my conception of knowledge is coming from, because that's a key thing I want to really try and focus on towards the latter part of the talk. And so the first part will give a little bit of background, not into myself, but the way that I think we think about cities. I'll then talk a little bit about Maputo as a city. I don't know how much people know about Maputo. Anybody here been to Maputo? Capital of Mozambique? Yeah? 1, 2, 3? Okay, so a few people know the city. I brought up Google Earth. I can sort of take you around the city a little bit, explain some of the mechanisms to you. That's the sort of thing you take ages to try to get enough information across just to contextualize, but probably best done through questioning. And if people have questions, I suggest you just shout them out during the talk. If heckling gets really bad, I'll have to perhaps revise that position, but it would be easier for me if people ask things to give me a direction what you're interested in, rather than me just spraffing on about things which I think you might be interested in. So I'll talk a bit about Maputo, then I'll talk a bit about the Home Space project. This is a fairly large interdisciplinary international project which finished up last year, and I'll show you the website is for that. There's a lot of material online. Couldn't possibly cover it all in one lecture anyway. So I'll point you at that, and then if there's specific questions and interest in, I'll talk a bit around that. And then I'd like to come back at the end, after all the heckling's over, or the heckling's died down, to talk a little bit about what I see as the major challenges for these three groups, as you see in the penultimate bullet point here, and then go on to thinking about the future challenges for cities and how we deal with the complexity of cities in terms of our knowledge base. So that's my objective, trying to get through all that in an hour roughly. Short introduction, who, where, what, how and why. I mean, some of this was covered very briefly by Steve. I'm an architect by original training. I worked in Africa initially as an architect 40 years ago. Went to Malawi. They were building a new capital city. There were only 6 architecture firms in the country, so we were overwhelmed with work, which is interesting, but working in a Banda dictatorship was just not my cup of tea. But it did take me to a decision I wanted to focus on what we would then call social architecture. This term really wasn't around at the time, sometimes called community architecture, but it's been a major focus for my architectural career from that point onwards. I went back to Africa fairly soon afterwards, and not wanting to work as a capital A architect, but a small a architect in social architecture, I worked for a local NGO in Botswana, the edge of the Kalahari, for 2.5 years, which was interesting because we were trying to train people who didn't get into secondary school in skills, and their production paid for their education. It's quite a well-known scheme. It was pioneered by a South African exile called Patrick van Rensburg. But what I learned from that process was that you can set up small pilot projects, but how you replicate from that is a challenge. Because here you had a relatively successful small local NGO with quite a bit of international support, but replicating that into a program at a national level, which in fact the Botswana government did in the end, had serious consequences. So my next move in Africa after that was to go to Mozambique. Here I thought, okay, post-independence country, proto-socialist line, land was nationalised, lots of opportunities in terms of development in the field of architecture and planning, housing provision, and in fact it was quite a unique experience. I spent a long time in Mozambique. I spent something like 13 years based in Mozambique. I was the city planner of Maputo City for about 5 years until the corruption just got too much to handle. I moved on into national government activity, working as a government employee. So I had a lot of sort of insider insight, because rather differently from when international aid or even professionals were brought out, you tend to be in a position of advising or counselling, but I was actually the head of department and so on. After that I worked for the United Nations and World Bank for a period of time, which reminded me about how difficult it was just to be a counsellor or advisor. And left from Mozambique in '93, worked in South Africa during the transition. And perhaps the most important thing to be learned from that period in Mozambique was that, yes, you could have a whole country which was like a pilot project, was doing very innovative things, but then you're in a world context of Cold War proxies in the region and severe climatic events taking place, very bad management at times because of the skills base available and so on. So, there were serious limitations of scaling up, even in a country that did want to scale up with more proactive programs. And I thought, okay, South Africa would be interesting, whole transition period. And it was interesting, but of course what happened in South Africa after the transition was that with the ANC coming into power so massively, they really didn't need to work with their base anymore. So very differently from what's happened in Brazil, where there's still a strong reliance in a coalition government with the base organisations of the PT and so on. You have an elite moving into power, and programmes becoming much less oriented to issues around redistribution. So these are all things which have affected the way that I have worked. And now, because I've worked in very different situations, I've worked in private architecture, I've worked in NGOs, I've worked with international agencies, with local central governments. And all of these various experiences mean you have to think about knowledge in a slightly different way. So when I came back into academia in 1996, I worked initially in a planning school and then split my time between that and the architecture school. I'm very aware of the differences in knowledge and the way we conceive of knowledge and the challenges that brings for a more interdisciplinary approach, which is what I'd like to come back to at the end of the talk. Just between architecture and planning, you'd think, oh, these are brother and sister type disciplines. They work closely together. Oh, they fight like cats and dogs. Perhaps that's the brother and sister relationship. But when you go beyond that and begin to look at the other elements of the social sciences in particular, which is what my own interest would be, there are many different issues around how we conceive it. So why is that important? And basically I say it's important because when we're focusing on something as complex as a city, we need to have much more complex and nuanced ways of thinking about that, and knowledge sets and analytical frameworks, which we don't have. And I'll talk about that when we talk about Maputo, about some of these concepts which exist and which we apply to a place like Maputo and really don't make a lot of sense and have no resonance on the ground. So overall, I believe that I've gone through a number of changing approaches myself. I think we're moving to a period when there is an opening for a change of approach in terms of how we think about cities in the south. That's not necessarily coming from governments in the south, who tend to have very pro-modern, simplistic views of modernity and modernisation processes related to that. But I think there are opportunities for change, and I think those opportunities perhaps need to be led from knowledge providers who may well be academics, but not exclusively so. So how we work around that, how we create these new frameworks for understanding, which are not necessarily bounded by our past experiences, what interests me in particular. So just very briefly, I think we need to review, and I won't do this in any depth, lots of people have done this in more depth. Jennifer Robinson was talking here, I believe, sometime, not too long ago. So she's got very good coverage of this. How we think about cities, how we think about urbanisation, urbanism, and urbanity. And as she argues herself, and I certainly agree with that, we map concepts which are basically north-centric. They've been developed in the north. They're still very much the currency in the north, and those have tended to be translated and taken overseas and brought into different contexts. So our understanding of the way we even conceive of the city, how we define a city, is very much based on this understanding of which came in the last 150 years of urban studies, and which began, of course, with a very empirical type of activity of Charles Booth and the like, working initially in a rather inductive way. And what I feel we do need to do is to become more empirical and inductive again, to begin to develop new sets of concepts. Because our conceptualization of the city and what is the good city, what is urban, what is the process of urbanization, how we conceive of that, is largely based on the ways that we thought about cities in the north. And this really is not applicable in many ways to cities in the south. And I would argue probably more so in Sub-Saharan Africa because of the extremely rapid urbanization in fairly unique circumstances of weak states and governance systems and weak economies, certainly weak so-called formal economies. Embedded on top of all of this sort of 150 years of thinking about urban and the urban studies related to that, we've had for the last 50 years or so, and again Jennifer Robinson talks about this, we've overlaid that with concepts about development. And I'm pretty critical of those concepts of development which perceive of development as being linear and progressive, and therefore we conceive of urban development in that terminology. And the other element which I'd like to raise here, and we can debate this perhaps as we talk about it, is to what extent one can counter the built-in bias in what I would call the global intellectual infrastructure, which is created not just by the academic institutions and their preponderance in the north, their growing influence over policy, for instance, north and south, and the publication mechanisms and the mechanisms for dissemination of knowledge, which tend to be still quite strongly concentrated in the north. Because I think that this is going to be also an issue to be dealt with in terms of new conceptualization, new inductive work. I think there has to be more of this led or embedded in an endogenous way as opposed to a strictly indigenous way in the south. So these are major challenges for new conceptual development. So to do this, I think we need to begin to learn from the cities of the south and learn from the cities of the south not through the lenses that we typically would apply to them as we have developed and refined these lenses over time from the north. So rather than learning from Las Vegas or Los Angeles, which are some of the tropes that are used in urban studies in architecture and planning, we need to engage with what I would call the extraordinary in the ordinary. And as Jennifer Robinson calls for a need to look on the cities of the south as ordinary cities. And I agree with that to an extent. They are ordinary in the sense that these are the cities which are the norm. These are the cities which predominate in terms of the urbanization process. And they will become more so during the rest of this century until possibly demographic stability and possibly urbanization stability is achieved. But all of these cities are extraordinary in the sense that they are different in the way they develop, in the way the dynamics which are taking place within them, which defy our normal terms of reference. And so they are extraordinary in that sense. We can't just apply our ordinary frames of reference to them, as I've been arguing. And they're also extraordinary in the sense that you can never really talk about the city as being something which is homogenic across the world or even across a particular nation state. All cities have many different factors. They're such complex mechanisms that each city in itself has extraordinary elements. So how is it that we're able to engage with the extraordinary and still have frames of reference which permit us to abstract knowledge and begin to work at a different level to be able to perhaps predict, begin to engage in interventionist ways with knowledge because it has been abstracted from the totally relativistic, almost totally relativistic extraordinary, without slipping into a reconceptualization of ordinariness. And some examples of this, I would say, for instance, we need to challenge our concept of urban, because our concept of urban is defined in a particular way, and therefore urbanization is defined in a particular way. And we're finding, of course, in situations in the South, particularly in contexts of rapid urbanizations, we're finding new, they may not be extremely new in terms of the dynamics involved, but we're certainly considering them much more important now. The forms of cyclical urbanization, whether it be on a weekly basis, monthly, annual, on a life cycle basis. So urbanization as this conceptualization that populations become urban and they stay urban. That's not necessarily the case. Perhaps proportions of population will become urban and stay urban, but there's enormous fluidity in the city, through the city, between the cities, as well as between the so-called rural and the so-called urban. Because the urban and the rural are becoming much more infused one with the other. And there are whole areas of what I would call urban, if you were to measure urban by levels of density of occupation, by nature of economic exchange, by social and cultural habits. These are different ways of defining the urban. And this type of urban exists in many places which are not seen as urban in an official or territorial sense. So if you look at the UN statistics are based on national statistics. Nation states define the urban by territorial limits usually, and there are increasingly large populations who have urban characteristics living outside of those territorial limits, and those are in what we generally would term the peri-urban in many cases, if they're outside the limits of existing cities. But there may be whole new forms of urban developing, particularly along major transport routes, around nodes and transport routes and so on. You have these concentrations of forms of urban activity and urban densities and typologies beginning to develop. Very noticeable in Africa. If you travel around a country like Mozambique, you see over a period of time, and I've been working in Mozambique since 1980, one way or the other, so it's about 33 years. And it used to be that you would travel between cities and you would just have bush on sides of the roads. But now what you have is almost a continuous linear settlement along the roads because people need to have one foot in at the cash economy, which is possible perhaps with access to the market, and one foot still in a subsistence economy, which needs access to land. And so you get this sort of form of ribbon or linear urbanization beginning to develop, which is not recognized or counted for in any way. Another typical example would be around crossing points of borders, including illegal crossing points of borders. You get sort of encampments beginning to develop. And this happens around the informal, illegal mining operations, the garimpeiros, as they would call them in Brazil and Mozambique. You get these different forms of urban form beginning to develop, which are completely ignored by any of the statistics. The most important of these are the peri-urban areas. And as cities like Maputo expand far beyond the territorial boundary of what is counted as urban, these are what we need to be dealing with. And these are not at all reflected in the statistics from national level upwards into the international statistics, and therefore the statistics which has 50% of the world's population are now urban. In many countries, it's way beyond that, of course. There's also the concept of peri-urban. The concept of peri-urban, of course, began because it was a periphery. It was a skin around the city. It was a relatively small area, and which it may still be around Oxford, for instance, in a definition. But the peri-urban in a place like Maputo or cities around Africa is the city. And it's not an adjunct to the city. It's not something which is less than the city. This became very obvious. Now, it was been obvious, to, of course, to those of us who work on these cities. But when you work with people living in these areas, they have a conceptualization of this being the city, but not like that city, but it is the city. And there's different terminology used for this. In Maputo, people talk about os bairros, which roughly translated is the neighborhoods. So os bairros are different from a cidade, which is what we call the cement city, the central colonial style city. And they're different from the rural o campo in Portuguese. So these concepts are very deeply there, and this is where the majority of people live. So peri-urban is a concept which is out of date. Then there's the whole idea of informality, which I'm pretty critical of, because we tend to see informality as being something which is a binary. Either it's formal, it's informal. Of course, many levels of what we would call formal are infused with informality, even in the UK. And one of the problems I have about this is that the bottom line definition of what is formal has got something to do with governments. And I think it's the famous analysis set around Lesotho by Scott, which talks about the role of governments and the way that they have to define, measure, and then control. And they attempt to do that, but of course fall in the vast mass of the urban sector that we're dealing with here and the rapid growth of that. And then it takes on into what we consider to be good about urban. And there's all sorts of embedded ideas about the good in urban, and there's all sorts of embedded ideas about the bad in urban, which come from the Victorian period. We've got the United Nations slipping back for the Millennium Development Goals using the term slums and defining it in a particular way in United Nations terminology, of course. But United Nations terminology itself is defined around three different concepts. One is to do with access to water and sanitation. One is to do with the sort of construction and square meter area of livable space. And the third to do with security of tenure. And the United Nations themselves in all of their documents say we don't have enough information about security of tenure to be able to really use this. So, we're dealing with something which is an incomplete concept even within its own concept. And there's a differentiation between the slum and the informal and so on and so forth. But because we use these terms, we're defining what is good and what we consider good in the urban, which means we consider most of the rest of it as bad. And that's usually the informal stuff. And because we're defining the good urban, we therefore have clear ideas, or do we, about what is good urbanism or what is urbanity. And I think we need to really challenge these attitudes. And so what I argue for, and the title of the talk, for instance, is all being well, will be a book coming out with Palgrave Macmillan sometime later in the year, which draws on the material that I'm drawing on today in a much deeper way, the space of a book, not just 30 minutes of talk. But what I'm calling for essentially is that I think we need to go back to what people like Charles Booth were doing in the early days, hopefully with a little less embedded subjectivity. But we need to be critical, we need to be basing our work on empirical evidence, and we need to be able to induce new forms of analytical concepts, which initially began in that period. So I'm calling for a new form of sort of critical empiricism, but one which can be open to new concepts in so doing. So this is an overview of the city of Maputo from space, but even Google gets it wrong because not all of this is Maputo city. There's local government reorganization has meant that the Maputo city actually is this bit, plus a part of across the bay. This is the ocean, in fact, it's a large bay. And then you have an island out here called Inyaka, which is also part of Maputo city. From this river valley across here to this limit, it's Matola city, it's a sister city. It was all part of Greater Maputo, certainly at the time that I was a city planner, and things have moved on obviously since then. But let me jump out here from PowerPoint and get into... So we begin to zoom in on this city. Of course, it's a Southern European creation, so it's very different from Anglophone or even Francophone African cities. We have what's called a cement city, and it's fairly clearly defined. This area, if you can see the hand, this is the central area of the city. The actual downtown center of the city, or the Baisha, is the central business district. It's down here. It's just expanded recently into reclaimed land. And then around this cement city, you had, from a very early period, the earliest aerial photographs that I've been able to identify when I was working there, from 1920s, 1930s, we had what would now be called informal settlements growing up around here. But the nature of informality here was often in that Mozambican indigenes weren't given the status to have rights to live in the city. They weren't necessarily excluded from the city in the way that might have happened in an Anglophone context, but they had their rights were severely curtailed. They couldn't own property in the city for large periods of the colonial, large portion of the colonial period. So what happened was that Portuguese colonizers were able to buy land in these areas and farm out land and housing for the indigenous population. And that created a form of formal informality from the very beginning of the city. And so there's a whole belt of that, which we sometimes call the inner belt around the city. Then beyond that, we had the period of state intervention, which actually began in the latter part of the colonial period. As you'll know, Portugal gave up its colonies, which were considered overseas provinces, gave them up very late in the decolonization process, gave them up very suddenly after quite a lot of bloodshed. So it was very different from the decolonization process from France and the UK. But immediately prior to independence, there was an attempt to deal with the local population and provide rights and provide access to land. And so there were some what we would call in the planning terminology sites and service schemes, basically simple plot layouts with very basic services, which were being provided in areas around the city, such as this one here, another one up here, another one up here. And then after independence, there was a big push for that type of development. So large areas of the city, such as this, have been developed with that period. You can see this ordered layout here, which began to take over for a short period over the form of physical disorder, which I don't denigrate at all because I think it's highly ordered in a social sense. What happened after that, though, in the 1990s through to the 2000s, and I'm focusing here on Maputo as opposed to Matola, is that you had a return to very weak capacity at national and local government level and fragmentation of any planning capacity in terms of ordering of the land or providing infrastructure or housing support. And you had a resurgence of what is generally termed informal settlement, such as these large areas here. Eventually, the city began to get its act together and began to plan areas, but it began to plan areas mainly for forced relocations. So a new major road being built to South Africa required moving lots of people, so we moved people because of that. And one of the areas that they were being moved to was a neighbourhood up here called CMC Biro. And that is a little bit of formality, let's say, a little bit of ordered formality in a sea of informality. And the floods of 2000, a lot of people in the city were washed out of their houses, and they were relocated again, always out to the periphery, of course, in these areas up here. You can see these different planned layouts. The interesting thing which happened from that period onwards was that people began to take the planning process on board in their social and cultural habits, and they picked up on the habits of the planners, sometimes with the technical staff from the City Council on the weekends, and they continued planning. So whenever you look at the actual available plans from the City Council in an area such as this, the official plan finishes more or less here, and another official plan finishes here, but all of this area in between, I'll just zoom in on it, is what we're terming now unofficially planned. All of this has a sort of sense of order to it. It basically repeats the planning process on a plot, road sandwich. But this has no formal plan. This is planned unofficially by local residents, local land rights holders who were going to lose their rights, lose the value of those rights. And they were able to capitalize on that by entering into agreements with the local level of administration and illegally subdividing, probably with topographers on the weekend, whole areas of the city have begun to develop in this area. This process is continuing outside the city boundary. This is the city boundary. This is where the Chinese construction company is building the new city ring road. And this whole area, for instance, again, planned informally, unofficially, but seen as legitimate. So when we were working on the last research, in Maputo, in the ethnographic part of the research, one of the things which the anthropologists in the team were working on was asking people what did they see as the ideal city and which part of the city would they like to move to. And many people said this area of the city, which is outside the city officially, this was being seen as the ideal. It's called Bairro Guava. Many people actually remarkably said this is what they thought was the apex of their ambition in terms of movement. So,
do we know why?
That's a
reactions are the same thing.
Yeah. Do we know why?
I think it's tied up with a sense of order and modernity. The plots are relatively slightly larger than the ones in the city, but it's seen as being something which has been produced recently. It's not under the control of the City Council in the same way. It's under the local authority, the Biro Secretary, it would be called the Neighbourhood Secretary control, but it isn't something which the City Council has had a hand in, and I think that's an element behind that. So one of the things which has interested me is to look at these new typologies which are beginning, these sort of new urban typologies. They're essentially forms of suburbanism, I think, beginning to emerge over a long period of time. I don't know if those of you have had some interest or contact with Maputo, read any of Morten Nielsen's work. He's a Danish anthropologist. And he did his PhD based in Maputo in some of these areas, looking at the dynamics of access to land and ideas about land and how people work around that. He's written quite a few pieces on this, so certainly Nielsen, N-I-E-L-S-E-N. You can Google him, find out. He talks about inverse governmentality. And basically what he was finding is that people like to be living in areas like this because they, even though it's not planned by the state, it looks like something that the state would have planned. And therefore, if you act like the state, there's less chance of you being hassled by the state. And so people actually are following more or less the norms in terms of planned layout, the plot size, setbacks for houses, the style of house that the state would probably want them to do, but without the state being directly involved. At the very local level, you have Biro or neighbourhood secretary, but they don't have this function. The lowest level, which has a function for planning or housing or infrastructure control, is the municipal level. And so they're not involved in these types of layouts. But people are producing these because they're essentially acting like the state. They want to avoid being hassled by the state. And this is seen as being a form of modernity. So this is something which is now being adopted, even though it hasn't been a long-term proposition for the city. But people have seen the other areas which were developed in the 1980s and 90s, and they see it as being proper urban areas. And so they feel this is something that they want to aspire to. And so this type of urban form develops, but it seems to only have developed in areas which were traditionally used for dry land agriculture. In other words, rain-fed agriculture, which were sparsely populated. These are areas where groundwater is very deep. You have to go down 70 meters to get groundwater. So people didn't actually build their homesteads in these areas. They built their homesteads slightly further towards the coast where they could dig wells and provide water for themselves. So they only used these areas, although they were under some form of traditional allocation system, they used them for the rain-fed agriculture. And they were, as such, relatively under-occupied at the time of the planning exercise. So it was possible to get the land rights holders together to agree on a cut for them, for the Biro secretary, for the topographers, and the others involved in the process. And so you get a relatively large area has been developed that way. That contrasts with areas which are slightly closer to the, if I zoom out slowly, quickly here, you get the idea that this is the sea over here. So this is the coastal plain. And then you have an escarpment running up to the railway line, which runs along here. And then you have the higher plain. But this part of the higher plain does have groundwater which is accessible. And so has been traditionally, and I use the term traditionally with inverted commas because traditions are being invented all the time in these conditions. But there has been a sort of form of peri-urban, shall I use, peri-rural settlement here for a very long time, going back to the colonial period and continuing since the colonial period, which really only has begun to densify in the last 20 or 30 years. And the form of occupation here and the form of densification and the nature of the order which is being established is rather different from what is happening further in. Because basically what is happening here is families who have access to land, to find a particular area. So here you'd have a family which had access to this piece of land, perhaps, if you can see the cursor. And what they've done is that they've begun to subdivide their land, and they make the subdivision in a more or less ordered, geometrically ordered way. But the actual contours of the land that they had the rights to were defined usually by natural elements, such as that cashew tree or that big rock, or over there where the pathway to Uncle So-and-so's house is. And so those boundaries were rather organic, shall we say, irregular. But people are beginning to subdivide that land within that. And that produces a type of urban fabric which is less ordered in the traditional sense, but has still a very strong sense of social and cultural order built within that. Essentially what that's repeating is the type of formation which is now less possible to see. I'm going to rectify this and get it vertical again in these areas. But this process is a later form of that second process I've been talking about. People who have had traditional land rights and begin to subdivide, and then people who have the plots subdivide again. It densifies in a rather different way from an area densifying which has an ordered layout like this. These areas, which were laid out in the programme I was involved in the 1980s, are densifying. There are usually 2-3 families on each plot. A lot of rental housing now beginning to develop, as other African cities, but that densifies within the structured urban layout. These areas densify in and around, pushing into the common spaces in a rather different way. But they are ordered, and that's the key issue that we're trying to get across. And in fact, Steve was mentioning the new book we're looking at, Order and Disorder in Urban Space and Form, we're working on is arguing that this is a type of order, because it is ordered socially and culturally. And that became, we're aware of that, but became much more evidenced through the ethnographic work which we did in the project. And one of the things we did towards the end of the project, we enlisted services of a documentary maker, and we've produced a documentary based on the research project, which is, we're still looking for a distributor for it, but I'll leave a copy of the DVD with you here, so if people are interested to look at. This picks up in the lives of 5 of the households which we worked with, and this idea of the way they're thinking about space, the way they think about order in space, and including the house itself, the home, how the house becomes a home, is much more patent in their own words in that type of work. Anyway, so that gives you some idea of just touching on some of the issues around the city. There are many more things we could talk about throughout your questions if you want. For instance, the role of the local authority, the corruption that's going on, large-scale middle-class development areas now happening. Here, for instance, the project I'm working on now is trying to document some of these new middle-class areas, up-and-coming middle-class areas, and the architecture and urban form that's coming out of those. Something I'm working on with the Faculty of Architecture there currently. But if it's okay, I would like to jump out from this and just show you the home space site. This is the URL for the home space material. Basically, if you just Google home space, one word, homespace.dk, it was Danish funded, so it's got a Danish tag. There's a short trailer here for the Africa Urban Dreams DVD, which I'm leaving. And the project was set up to begin to hopefully move towards this type of critical empirical work that I've been calling for. We deliberately wanted to try to challenge some of these ideas of urbanisation. What is urban? What is the good urban? What is urbanity? And find new forms of evidence and be fairly open and inductive about that as best possible. The research was structured around 3 major survey instruments. One was a physical survey, and related to that were socioeconomic survey instruments. So basically a semi-structured questionnaire, interview form. Those picked up on work I'd undertaken in 1990. When I was working for the United Nations in Maputo, I did a survey which had physical and socioeconomic elements. We were able to go back to those families in 2010. So we have a 20-year comparison for some of them. And then I did other work around the urban land market in 2000, and we were able to go back to most of those families. Some of them we weren't able to identify, again, with rapid change. And so we had a 10-year longitudinal element. So as a lot of longitudinal research, particularly in urban Africa, doesn't set out to be longitudinal. You've just got an opportunity and you try to tie it in. That was the experience of people like Karen Hansen, who did longitudinal work in Nairobi, in Lusaka, and so on. So what we tried to build in here is the longitudinal element to this work, which is mostly focused on the physical, but from the 2000 to 2010 we have socioeconomical longitudinal comparative material. And then the third major element, which we hadn't done in 1990 or 2000, was the ethnographic work. So the overall sample which we worked with was 100 cases. If I find one of the... all the publications are online, mostly in English. Some of them are in Portuguese as well. The summaries are all in both languages. So there's a context report which tries to, I guess, explain what we're trying to do with the study and tries to place the experience of Maputo in a wider context. It's like Russian dolls. So what's the relevance of Maputo for Mozambique? What's the relevance of Mozambique for Sub-Saharan African cities? And then within Maputo, what's the relevance of that particular vector or that particular line of expansion of the city? And within that, what's the significance of the 100 case studies that we've studied in detail? And then within that, again, the 19 families that we were able to do ethnographic work with, and how did these all tie together? It underpins the validity, to some extent, of the work, and tries to argue for a validity beyond the specific. The ethnographic report, which worked with 19 specific families, and then was followed up with 5 of those families for the documentary production. The built environment study, which looks at the house change and the nature of the popular architecture which is emerging, which is a language which is not vernacular architecture in the way that's defined, and it's not modern architecture in the way that that's defined, no architects involved and so on, but it's a popular form, and quite a strong popular form beginning, a new popular form beginning to emerge from a previous popular form is there. And then the socioeconomic report, which looks at the socioeconomic material from the 100 families. And then I tried to draw it all together in a synthesis report, which tries to go back to what are our original intention in terms of querying some of these concepts: urbanisation, urban, what is peri-urban, what is informal, and so on. And also talks more specifically about key issues in the city and that particular city and how those seem to be mapping onto other cities in Sub-Saharan Africa. The reports are all available there. Some of it, I hope, will come out in papers in the book that I'm hoping to produce later in the year. Certainly the material that I authored here will be the basis for the book. And we're running a discussion group at the European Centre of African Studies in Lisbon in about a month's time, based on not only on this work, but other colleagues such as Adelina Baptista here at the centre is presenting a paper there on work on Maputo. So there's a body of evidence here which we hope will be of use to others as well. So going back then into the so this is the view from the home space. This is just some of the documentary material. We have, apart from the documentary film, we have documented the physical context of the house, the plot inside the house through photography. So what are the challenges that are going out of this? And to keep me, I'm okay for time? Yeah. I'll be fairly quick now. Yeah. For urban dwellers, in most sub-Saharan urban areas, whether these urban areas are recognised as urban or not, it's actually the residents who are creating the city. That's what we argue very strongly from this material. And they're doing that through their everyday acts of dwelling as a verb as well as dwelling as a place. And of course that happens within specific political economic structures, but it is significantly shaped by social and cultural institutions. So a lot of the work I do, I would draw on new institutionalism as an analytical framework, which tries to balance the structural with the structure of agency and the role of the relationship between the two and how we understand that. And we're talking about social cultural institutions here as both the organizational forms of institutions, such as, for instance, the Biro secretary and his role, but equally it's the values and concepts. What do people think about the home? What do people think about the space around them, the rights to the space and so on? Those are more deeply embedded. But essentially urban dwellers are seeking forms of security, shelter, infrastructure, income, social interaction, cultural expression, new forms of identity. It's a complex mix. People have very complex lives. And a lot of it is about risk management. And what becomes immediately apparent, particularly in Maputo and I think in many other sub-Saharan African cities, is that very little of what people seek is actually supplied in any proactive way by the state. And people don't really expect the state to provide this. In fact, they tend to want to avoid the state or sometimes copy what the state might want to do. And that also goes for the state-regulated private sector. And so what we're arguing is that the social and cultural contexts are much more important for the whole physical element of urban growth than they've been assumed to be in the past. So there's a whole history of architecture and planning which has grown up, which largely ignores the majority social and cultural values which are embedded. And so we're calling attention to that, saying we really need to start with those values and how people perceive of space and how they organise space, how space is controlled in reality, in real political situations, to be able to understand how you could intervene in the space, which challenges planning as a top-down mechanism, which is the way it is generally implemented. Through time, we do believe that the level of political engagement will grow, but currently people don't engage. Typically you ask people, did they vote? And they say, oh yes, we voted in the national election. Did you vote in the local government elections? No, there's no point because we've got so many politicians, just more people are going to eat off our backs. So there's really low levels of political engagement in that sense. I mean, the local government election, which is coming up in Mozambique towards the end of the year, will be interesting to see, because in the last one 5 years ago, it was down as low as 10 to 12% participation from the electorate. And that's a fairly recent process. This is the third set of elections. But I think political engagement will grow in time, but it could be a long time before it grows to the extent that you see in Brazil or South Africa. Challenges for urban interventionists. We've always assumed as urban interventionists that the state has a dominant role in modernization and therefore in the dealing with the urban. And that's been going on for the past century and a half, ever since we had the first public health officers being created in the cities around the UK. And we've particularly spent the last half decade talking about development through development studies, development policy and praxis and so on, as a major paradigm. But the possibility of how these things are conceptualized being applicable in the reality today is seriously challenged, particularly in urban areas. And so I think that we do need to think beyond the state in many ways and begin to think, well, if social and cultural values are so important and it's the dwellers who are making the city based on those social and cultural values, how do we understand those and how do we interact with those social and cultural values? I would probably hazard a statement such as Brazilian soap operas are probably much more important influence than the government in Mozambique. So we need to think in different ways about how we can intervene. Where the state is relatively weak, it still has a crucial role to play, because I'm certainly not letting the state off the hook here. But I would argue their role is one of guiding and not trying to order and attempting to control, which is a tradition which you've inherited from the past here. Over the weekend, I was staying with friends near Epping Forest, and we went to look at the plot lands over near Basildon, where people, I don't know the history of the plot lands in the UK, Londoners were able to buy a small piece of land and were like allotments, and they built holiday houses there, and then during the Blitz they moved out to the plot lands, and then the local government had to get rid of them and spent years and years and years and built a whole new town as part of the process just to get rid of them. So now they're all knocked down, and one is left as a museum. It's a very British thing to do. What they did in Northern Europe, of course, is they let people live on their plot lands for a certain time of the year. Anyway, that's just an aside in terms of that. But the state can't control in the way that it's controlled in the north. It won't be able to control in most cities in the south in that way, probably ever, but certainly not in the foreseeable future. So we have to go beyond the state and focus on what are the finite capacities of the state, and help the state to realize it has finite capacity and focus that capacity and use it. And what should it use it for? It should use it for something which is much more proactive, probably more redistributive, but which requires an orientation of political will which is really not there in many situations in the south. And here I would argue that really what has to happen is that there needs to be what I'm calling here an outing of the urban realpolitik. Because when you get down to that local level in cities, and I know a lot about this because my wife's Mozambican, we live in a peri-urban area in Maputo, so a lot of my understanding of the city comes from that as much as doing research. When you get down to that level, the realpolitik of the power of the secretary of the neighbourhood, the power of the quarter secretary, and the way you interact and how that power is always mitigated by the residents as sort of subaltern actors, that's very important. That needs to be studied much more. That's where urban realpolitik takes place. That's why whenever at a higher city level there's an indication, we have to bulldoze these people out because we're going to have an airport extension, but it doesn't happen for 10 or 15 years. That's realpolitik, because that's really what's happening at a ground level. We need to understand that a lot more and then work within that context of what is possible in the realpolitik, because that's where urban residents really do engage. And that's way beyond this concept of decentralization, very simplistic concept of decentralization that international agencies have been purveying around the region for ages. The idea that if you have independent local authorities, they'll be closer to the residents of cities, and therefore they'll be more democratic. That is not playing out, and we're now in a stage where that needs to be critiqued. So for urban scholars, and that's the audience I'm presuming I'm dealing with here, I think we need to move to a post-developmental paradigm which is based on new understandings of modernity, modernism and modernization, which is obviously expressed in now what we would call a majority urban world, through a wider and much more positive approach to the nature of urbanization. We still talk about urbanization as if it's a bad thing. The Department for International Development in the UK is perhaps one of the worst offenders about this. They still tend to think that, no, we keep them on the farm. But urbanisation is not going to stop just because of that. And we need to have an acceptance of these emerging forms of urbanism. We can't always be saying the peri-urban is something which is becoming. And some of my colleagues and scholars, like Abdul Malik Simone, writes very eloquently about the city which is yet to come. I don't think we can wait for that city which is yet to come. The city is here, it's now, it's happening, it's changing all the time, of course. But we need to recognize that and celebrate that and work within that. And through that, we should celebrate different expressions of urbanity. The way that people express themselves in Maputo, it's an urban lifestyle. It's certainly not rural, it's certainly not urban in the sense that we would have understood it in a more traditional northern sense, but it's certainly urbane as well as being urban. So to achieve this, I think, means re-engaging with empirical realities and engaging in inductive processes to help us find new and more relevant concepts and analytical categories. I think we need to do that in a self-critical way to avoid the prejudice which potentially could underpin these. But it also means going beyond disciplinary boundaries. And this is how I think some of the biggest challenges are. So what are relevant forms of knowledge here? Increasingly, we've seen the academy has captured the high ground in the intellectual endeavour through its extreme and increasingly fragmented disciplinary specialisation and the perceived need in social democracies to base policy on evidence. So, there's some very good books about the academization of knowledge, where other forms of specialisation of knowledge have been pushed to the side. Specialisation of this type, however, means that academics also become constrained in some form of disciplinary straitjacket, mainly because the peer review process is structured in such a way that it really hinders non-disciplinary work, stimulating at best some form of multidisciplinary view. Interdisciplinary in the sense of being able to integrate ways of thinking, concepts, and challenge in a challenging situation. Interdisciplinary work can help to align epistemologies and concepts, methodologies, and even different forms of resource access, which is a significant challenge. But I would argue that what I would call transdisciplinarity is what's needed to face the complexity of a global urban future in a much more flexible way. That's an ability to step outside the box and rethink the nature of knowledge, concepts, and analysis as part of that process of working together, as well as rethinking methods and how knowledge is used, which is maybe the focus for interdisciplinarity. And here I draw on a diagram which is in this reference by Ramadia. It's a special edition of Futures magazine, which is from 2004. Perhaps a little bit difficult to read it there. But he basically argues that, on the left we have various disciplinary approaches in isolation. Then we have the multidisciplinary, which is the second block along, where various approaches are coordinated to a subject and joint engagement takes place, but different knowledges are compared in some sort of relationship, usually with some acknowledgement of complexity. But we're still working in the sense of knowledge being a simplification of what is actually there to understand better and analyse. Interdisciplinary in a diagrammatic form is overlapping, and here we have various coordinated approaches to a subject through some conceptual alignment. New knowledge was produced to approach complexity, but often it turns out to be the lowest common denominator, because in fact we all have to work together, so we can't really trash each other's basic ideas. And what people like Ramedier argue for is this concept of transdisciplinary. We were having a chat about this earlier. Perhaps this is just good interdisciplinarity, may well be. So we won't play with semantics. But the idea behind transdisciplinarity is that we go beyond the disciplines, hence the grey is beyond the boxes in a diagrammatic sense here. New approaches to a subject are sought, derived from unpacking disciplines. New knowledge is produced with aspiration to a highest common factor, not a lowest common denominator, and there's a strong focus on complexity. So I would argue that given the complexity of the urban, and particularly the urban as we are experiencing it in this century and throughout this century, when urbanisation and demographic stability may tail off, may not. So we need to move to this new critical empirical understanding of these increasingly complex. They're just going to get more complex as urban futures evolve. And we can use a focus on the new realities manifested in the global south as a way to focus this, but it will require this type of transdisciplinarity. And ideally, that type of approach and that type of initiative would actually be based in the south. So I'll leave it at that.
questions?
Paul, following on your very last paragraph, sentence, your conclusion, could it be that phenomenology could offer some of the clues? If you understand phenomenological approach to understanding things, knowledge, could it be that there is a lot there in the field of phenomenology actually that could help urban specialists and others create that new knowledge that you're talking about?
Yeah, I think I don't think there's one approach which will be the key to understanding, and I think phenomenology will be one approach within that social construction of knowledge. We have to understand the way that people are perceiving of the knowledge from within, not just from without. But that will be just one of the elements of how people express themselves. And therefore we begin to understand and help through that process of engaging in the understanding, the process of understanding, widen the understanding of what these concepts would be. So I think that happens, for instance, whenever you're working with people in a more ethnographic situation, you're talking, as perhaps the anthropologists would do, about a concept which is inevitably brought in by the anthropologist. People in that situation may not perceive of land rights, whatever it may be, in that particular way, but through that process there's an interaction. So the unpacking of the phenomenological permits equally a widening of the understanding, not just from the researcher, but from the point of view of the people who are interacting.
Thank you very much. I appreciated your emphasis on the need for more empirical research on the ground, precisely because when you start giving a very detailed case study, such as you presented, one realizes how different places are. And my question basically is related to this. I work primarily in Tanzania, and in fact in the mining settlements, I couldn't agree with you more about the enormous amount of urbanization that goes unrecognized, maybe for better or for worse, actually, given certain aspects of government attitude. However, what surprised me, and I'd like to get behind it, so to speak, is your emphasis on people's desire for a sense of order in a planning sense, partially to keep the government away. However, I don't really see that in Tanzania, and I'm wondering if that has to do with the Portuguese legacy as opposed to the British. And somebody like you who's had such experience in very different urban contexts, wondering if you could comment on that and the fact that we really have to start defining urbanism around the continent with respect to all sorts of different factors. And finally, again, in terms of locational choice, you were remarking about how this related to planning, but wondering if it's starting to affect a place like Maputo, the whole traffic problem. I mean, with the growth of so-called middle classes, Dar es Salaam has become almost unlivable, and people are now choosing their location to be as close as possible to work to avoid being in traffic jams for 2 to 3 hours per day. So there's all sorts of new factors involved in calculation of ideal home and ideal location.
Deal with perhaps the last element first. Most of the people aspiring to move to Guava, which is this new emerging proto-suburbia, let's say, outside the city, aren't in the middle class and don't have access to vehicles. That process is happening as the middle class are moving out, and that's currently what I'm looking at in a bit more detail. They're moving out increasingly through closed condominium developments, through so-called youth housing developments, which are anybody under 45, and out along the coastline. There are big traffic problems associated with that, but that wasn't relevant. That wasn't an element of what.
They don't have to take buses?
Well, yes, they do, but then the bus system generally is moving in the buses are the best way to get through the traffic, either that or a motorcycle, because the buses don't respect the traffic. I don't know what it's like in Dar es Salaam. I mean, you have the queue of traffic going in, and it's essentially a 2-track road with a bit of space at the side where people are selling stuff, and whenever the track going in is blocked, then the buses start going up the inside. So the sellers just have to get out of the way. And then whenever that gets blocked, then they start driving up the wrong side of the road. And when that gets blocked, then they drive up the other side of the hard shoulder. So the buses get through, the minibuses. It's not, I'm not condoning this, but certainly, and you know, a lot of people still are moving into the centre or nearer the centre, but there's a lot more dispersion of income generating activities for the lower middle and the I wouldn't say the working class, but for the majority population of the city. So that's not necessarily drawing them into the centre in the same way as that middle class, all those middle class jobs are in the centre. So that's a bigger issue. The second point you were making?
The whole colonial.
Yes, whether it's no, I think you'll find in other African countries as well, whether it's, I haven't been to Tanzania for a while now, I think it's tied up with the conception of modernity. Certainly in the early upgrading projects which were being written up around the region, generally they had this problem because the architects would say, oh no, we can have a winding road, we don't have to have a straight road, and we'll knock down less houses this way, we try and avoid the houses. And people say, no, we have to have the straight road, and if they built the house in the wrong place, that's their problem. And that was something which was happening. It wasn't just reported in terms of the Mozambican experience, it was reported in Zambia, for instance, reported in various other areas. So I think that concept of the straight street being seen as being modern is quite deeply embedded. So, yeah, I don't know if it's particularly. There's very large areas of the city of Maputo. Majority would be the so-called informal, unplanned, which have that typology. Which, what I'm suggesting is that there's an element of planning which is taking place within homestead, the regional homestead subdividing. So there's still a sense of order being produced in that. But I think that's tied up with our concepts: what is modern, what is good.
What is the population of Maputo, even including all of the peri-urban areas? I mean, it would be good to have some idea of that.
We were estimating, at the time we were working on the research, 2011 population, extrapolating from the 2007 census material, that the metropolitan area, which is the two cities together, Maputo and Matola, plus the expansion into the immediate provincial districts to the north, and it's also happening to the south. We're probably about 2.4 million at that stage, so it's probably 2.8 million perhaps now. It's very hard to tie down the populations because the census populations are not that accurate in a way, and they keep making new subdivisions. For this new local government election coming up, they've decided at the last minute they're going to have one new local authority in every province. And so they've just created one south of the city of Matola as a new local authority. So that will throw out the statistics again. But the contextual report places Maputo, Greater Maputo, the 2.4 million, into a broader span of Sub-Saharan African cities. It's in the top 12 if you include it as a metropolitan area.
Thank you. It's really interesting. This idea of you're looking at calling for more critical or empirical research, as you're trying to get more appropriate analytical concepts. I'm working on migration. I want to do a similar sort of thing in Sub-Saharan Africa. The question I have though is, if what analytical concepts are you coming up with that can you reflect that back to Las Vegas, say, which you presented at the beginning? Are the concepts you're looking at, they're empirically very rich for Maputo and maybe other cities in Sub-Saharan Africa, but does it actually then say anything more generally about urbanism? Does the idea of urban mean the same thing across the world? Is there any, can we abstract anything from this? So does the experience you're getting from Sub-Saharan Africa have anything to say, maybe to change and challenge the whole idea of urbanity and urbanism?
I think it may well do. I wouldn't personally go as far as that, although I do quite a bit of work in the north, but it's perhaps more of my architecture hat on. I think through time we're moving away in the north from the welfare state settlement, that we're in the post-Fordist arrangement, we're moving to flexible working. In 2 or 3 generations, I think we're going to find a much more flexible arrangements in terms of living, working, and where people live and work, and I think that will affect migration. I don't think it will necessarily reflect an out-migration into what might be seen as non-urban, i.e. rural areas. But this is to some extent relative, because if you, for instance, go to the Netherlands, is there anything in the Netherlands which is not urban? But it has areas which don't have densities which are urban, but everyone living there is urban and working in urban centres, and they've just managed their urbanisation process in such a way that all rural is a form of urban. So I think we may move to that. Certainly in the European Union, there have been big pushes for the polycentric city as a sort of trope in the way of thinking about the city and how it might go in future. And I think that's an aspiration in that we have polycentric cities and we're moving towards perhaps planning better with that concept. But probably what will happen in terms of where people live and how people move around, particularly as we move into a new generation of rented accommodation that's predicted for the UK, will have serious effects. So all I could say is that I'd be interested to talk to people who are more involved in that, and try and spark off some sort of ideas around that. And I do believe we can learn from the South and the North, much more than we tend to do. But I don't have an answer.
That's not how to cross the plan this present.
Probably the last question, because Paula has to get a bus.
Thanks, Paul. I understand how your sort of planning for real exercise works in relation to thinking about home spaces and the organisation of communities from the home perspective. But what happens when you start thinking about bigger, more contested infrastructures like road building or the location of hospitals, or things that are often very much contested in terms of equality of opportunity, equality of access, when you're working with these agents on the ground that are sort of semi-representatives but not elected of a community, they always want those things for themselves, and how you plan the negotiation around those bigger things if you haven't got that centralising force of a strong state.
I think that one of the things I would say that the state has to focus on is that strategic level of planning, like where the new ring road would go and the implications for that. Unfortunately, the tendency now is that that gets captured by an elite. So as soon as they know the ring road is going in that particular area, then there's a big rush for land there before everybody else gets there. That's exactly what has happened in Maputo. In fact, some of my own family's land has been suffering because of that. My wife's family's land has been suffering because of that process. That's an element, but it's also so much more difficult to engage in. You mentioned planning for real, and I would talk here more about small change, which is Nabil Hamdi's way of talking about planning, or Patrick Geddes.
I guess I'm thinking about Geddes sort of the early stuff where you're going into.
The reason I just pick up on the planning for real is a way to get people to participate in a planning process, and of course that's exactly what doesn't happen at that strategic level of planning. It doesn't happen even in the UK at structure plan level or city regional plan level. It's the most difficult thing to inculcate participation around because it's so much more abstract. People get up in arms if they know there's going to be a new coal mine down the end of the road, or even just a new housing estate at the end of the road, or a new Tesco. But to be able to work out the implications of a demographic projection and how that might be distributed around the Oxford region, people just don't really get up in arms about that. But that already is built into the process, and that's a major problem about engaging in the planning process. It happens all over the world. I think it's probably slightly less prevalent in situations such as Sub-Saharan Africa because there's a lot less large-scale infrastructure going in, and when it does go in, it takes much longer to take place because of all that local level realpolitik which happens. Over the weekend I was reading a book set in a Mumbai slum beyond the beautiful Forevers, and it's set in a slum at the airport which has taken 12 years to be able to be removed because there's a whole political machine which is basing itself on the possible removal or possible retention of those people. And I think it's at that level of realpolitik that it's not a participatory exercise, but that level of realpolitik will begin to emerge and become more evident in time in places like Maputo. It's already there in the Brazilian cities, and I think a city like Maputo follows a Brazilian trend rather than an Anglophone or Francophone trend in terms of how land and urbanization, urban form will develop. So it's not an ideal situation, but I think it will express itself through time.
Well, thank you very much, Paul. You've given us plenty to think about. We appreciate your provocation to a new empiricism, if I can call it that. We wish you the very best of luck in your new appointment at VITS next academic year, and thank you so much for spending the time to come down and talk to us today. Thank you.
Gotcha.